Is it on? Okay. Guilty as charged. Oh, that's fine. Yeah, that's great. So we say in that Gatha ahead of Teisho to open the space, we say that the Dharma is rarely encountered, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. Of course, every particle of every nanosecond of each moment is riddled with Dharma. But how often do we notice that? How often do we encounter it? How often are we available to that fact? Well, that's something I want to look into tonight. And I have been struck from the first time I came up here to Kunanyi House. We turned into the, I think it's Huon Road that winds its way up. And the sign said Kunanyi with a small K, stroke Mount Wellington. I was so happy to see that. So happy to see the self-importance of Mount Wellington, whoever Wellington was, whichever Wellington it was named after, some naval lord, no doubt. To see that dropping off and to see it dropping off back into the ancient, in fact timeless time of Kunanyi, who doesn't even bother to have a capital K. There's no self-important capital like the one we give ourselves, I, in the way of this mountain. It has nothing in the way. It is completely, utterly itself with sufficiency that delights us all the time we're here. But we do seem to be at times burdened with this capital I, self. Sometimes we're burdened by it, other times we burden others with it. And real intimacy begins in the moment when we make that move of the heart to cease burdening self or other with this sense of a self that is carved out of this rich, wondrous, mysterious whole that has created us. There is a line in the Song of Solomon that addresses this in its own strange way. It's very simple, and it's a beautiful koan for practice. It says this: I sleep, but my heart wakes. So this sense of I sleeps. And when the sense of I sleeps, in a sense you could say practice is the very careful putting to sleep of that sense of I so that the heart can wake, that we can wake with our hearts awake. So perhaps there is in this great matter of not knowing that we touched on this morning, perhaps there is a love story here. My heart wakes when I sleep. That word sleep is a little like Dogen's forgetting. I forget, to study the self is to forget the self. It's a matter to look into, but I'll come to Dogen in a minute. So this not knowing, it's always the matter taken up in the first talk of any retreat session. Because, I guess you could say, it is the essentially or particularly most spirited Zen gate of practice. This spirit and activity of not knowing And it's usually presented, as it was so vigorously and beautifully by Jiao in the case that is known as Mu. Just as we have mountains and rivers on the wall up there, Zendos throughout the world have got some vigorous rendition of the character Mu. It's really translated, well, it has many ways that it can fall open. One of them is no, but it's actually less even than no. No might look like a rather strange way to present the open gate, but indeed it is the open gate. If you put self after that no, perhaps you begin to see why no self might be the open gate. And if you're standing in the presence of a tree, if you can approach that moment with no tree uppermost in your being, you might actually, for the first time, be met by a tree, fully. So this no is a very open gate. Other times it's translated as no nothingness, or if you look at that more carefully, no thingness. No thingness. No thing carved out from anything else. Already I hope you can see the intimacy in that no-thingness. So how did this come about, this strange word mu, which we permit to take the place of explanation, of some way of trying to capture the inconceivable? We know we can only stand before it as a mystery. Stand naked and joyful before it as a mystery. So this is how it arose. A monk happened to ask Jiao, 9th century, extraordinary old teacher, and I do mean old, somewhere between 80 and 120 years old when he encountered this monk. And the monk asked him, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Notice the or not. This monk is trying to cover every single exit point for the question. He's not going to let this teacher escape. He wants to know about his own self-nature. Does a dog have it or not? And Jiao responds with mu, which is a word even less than no. It's a little bit more like non-hyphen or un-hyphen. So that monk has to set about allowing mu to reach him, allowing the undoing that mu offers to completely reach him, touch him. There's no argument about dogs, by the way. If you've ever met a dog, you know they have complete dog Buddha nature. No question. And of course this monk would know that all beings, all sentient beings, are said to share Buddha nature. Perhaps he was wondering about himself with some kind of self-disgust or self-pity. So, mu, we're left with mu as the name of what can't be named, as a kind of syllable right on the very edge of silence itself. And notice that if you put no in front of it, or does not have, or is not, really it's saying that a dog does not have Buddha nature and does not have Buddha nature. It offers mu to both possibilities. So all exit doors are flung open by this no. This monk now, and we now, have no alternative but to make our way through that open gate. So it is called the first gate of the practice, the first gate of opening to this seamless, undivided reality. So on Thursday night, I quoted the words of Dogen that touch into this very deeply. To study the Buddha way is, or the Zen way, sometimes, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things, the 10,000 things, as it's sometimes translated in Chinese, meaning each particle of matter, each moment, each bright particular you encounter. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away, says Dogen. Now, this body and mind drops away is the profound experience that Dogen had in the presence of his teacher when he heard those words spoken in the dojo. He heard his teacher in China say, "Body and mind dropped away, drop away body and mind." And you could almost say that caught Dogen at a moment when he was completely available. And it was like everything falling through the floor, through into, well, all he could say about it is the dropped away body and mind. What's dropped away at that moment is his sense of a separate self that is trapped in a sense of its own inviolable kind of and a somewhat unfortunate exile from the whole. We don't think of it that way most of the time, but when you look at the seamlessness of the forest here, for example, the way everything does move together, the way everything is in company and in infinite relationship with each other, even conversation with each other. One time when I was walking and learning with Uncle Max Harrison, Indigenous elder I've spent a lot of time with, he had us suddenly drive up from the highway we were on, up onto the escarpment nearby, where there had been a very serious fire. The fire had burned its way up, as they do, up the cliff and up the hillside, and it has scorched all the plants right at the edge of this lip of the escarpment, back to charred cinders. There had been really dense moss growing there because it was a hanging swamp, in fact, a hanging, as they're called, water seeping over sandstone, pooled, and so a mossy area had grown there. So we went up there and we walked around for a while. We began to really notice that there was something strange going on here. The water flowed down the shelf of the rock, but right at the edge where all these very, very burnt plants were, the moss was dry. It's as though gravity itself was being not permitted. The water could not flow all the way to the burnt plants. Just a little trickle here and there, whereas further up it was spongy wet. So after a while, this realization dawned on those of us who were here, and we asked, what's going on here? And Uncle Max said in the most simple way, really, well, you don't give big gulps of water, just little tiny sips, to someone who's been very badly burnt. And we began to realize that all these trees were in conversation, intimate conversation with each other, and holding back the water and just letting it down very, very in small ways. So suddenly, we're not in among separate trees, this thing, that thing, that thing. We're inside the mind, a shared mind up there. So that's what I mean about not carved out, nothing carved out in the living world. But our sense of I can be very carved out. And we have to soften our way back in with practice. So Dogen says to study the self is to begin to discover you cannot find this self. At the deepest level, you will not find the self you have made up. Find something much better. And that's what he means by to forget the self. This forgetting the self is the recovery of this seamless relationship with all that is. He talks about them coming forward, advancing and confirming the self, the true self. Whereas our minds normally go out and try and grasp and name and distinguish one thing from another. And he says that is delusion. It's when we stop imposing this bruising self upon things that the 10,000 humble, intimate things can reach us, can touch us. So this process, this practice of working with Mu, offering ourselves to this unknown with the action of not knowing, is sort of, it could be described as a kind of blessed undoing of this separate self. And lately I've gone back to reading and making contact with a very dear friend of mine, Jacques Lusseron, who, this book is subtitled A Blind Hero of the French Resistance. Jacques Lusseron went blind at the age of 7 in an accident. I nearly said an unfortunate accident, but he, if he was alive, would say there was nothing unfortunate about it. The title of the book is And There Was Light, because he found that when he went completely blind, his eyes, in fact, were flooded with with an intense light that could, in fact, discern, could almost feel out and feel the shapes of trees. And it's an extraordinary account of how the apparent blindness, in fact, was not what we would call dark or blind or limited at all. In fact, I think he would probably say that this was actually the discovery. Becoming blind was the real discovery for him of the infinite touch of the world upon the human being. So I'd like to read you a few little bits just to give you a sense, because when we're meditating, we do veil our eyes. We allow the grasping, distinguishing action of the mind to sort of, we rest it, we fast it for a while. And of course we begin to really listen and hear and feel more deeply. This is exactly what he talks about. So here he is talking about sound, for example. He says, you always think of sounds beginning and ending abruptly, but now I realize that nothing could be more false. Now my ears heard the sounds almost before they were there, touching me with the tips of their fingers and directing me toward them. Often I seem to hear people speak before they began talking. I had an experience of this once in a class with a lot of little 7 to 10-year-olds, a meditation class, when I told them simply to listen for the very tiniest sound they could hear. And they all went into the deepest meditation I've ever seen them offer themselves to, and they went and and they heard all sorts of things. They heard the leaves rubbing together, right across the playground. They heard this, they heard that. And then one said, I heard someone about to be hurt. About to be hurt. This is how tender their listening grew. He goes on, sounds had the same individuality as light. They were neither inside nor outside. They were passing through me. They gave me my bearings in space and put me in touch with things. It was not like signals that they functioned. We call sounds signals. It was not like signals that they functioned, but like replies. I remember well when I first arrived at the beach 2 months after the accident. It was evening. There was nothing there but the sea and its voice, precise beyond the power to imagine it. It formed a mass which was so heavy and so limpid that I could have leaned against it like a wall. It spoke to me in several layers all at once. The waves were arranged in steps, and together they made one music, though what they said was different in each voice. By the way, sit comfortably, Chris, as comfortably as you wish. There was rasping in the bass and bubbling in the top register. I didn't need to be told about the things that eyes could see. He also speaks about touch. In fact, all of this, in a way, is about the discovery of the real touch. So he says, because after all, blind people, literally feel their way through the world with all their senses. He says, our eyes run over the surfaces of things. All they require are a few scattered points, since they can bridge the gap in a flash. So they half see much more than they see, and they never weigh. They are satisfied with appearances, and for them the world glows and slides by, but lacks substance. All I needed was to leave my hands to their own devices. I had nothing to teach them, and besides, since they began working independently, they seemed to foresee everything. Unlike eyes, they were in earnest, and from whatever direction they approached an object, they covered it, tested its resistance, leaned against the mass of it, and recorded every irregularity in its surface. They measured it for height and thickness, taking in as many dimensions as possible. But most of all, having learned that they had fingers, interesting, well, we assume we've got fingers, but he learned his hands had fingers. They used them in an entirely new way. When I had eyes, my fingers used to be stiff, held dead at the ends of my hands, good only for picking up things. But now each one of them started out on its own. They explored things separately, changed levels, and independently of each other made themselves heavy or light. And he talks about the beauty, the luxuriousness of feeling things, of pressing on a table and feeling the table return the pressure. To find out my fingers had to bear down, and the amazing thing is that the pressure was answered by the table at once. Being blind, I thought I should have to go out to meet things, but I found that they came to meet me instead. I have never had to go more than halfway, and the universe became the accomplice of all my wishes. This is Dogen in action. This is the 10,000 things can advance and confirm the self. Because we're not, he was not. He had, in a sense, allowed the grasping kind of part of his mind to subside with this blindness, and look what opened up. As a child, I spent hours leaning against objects and letting them lean against me. Any blind person can tell you that this gesture, this exchange, gives a satisfaction too deep for words. And I want to end with this I could read this for a long time because he's beautiful. It's a beautiful human being who went on to do extraordinary things in the French Resistance as a blind 17-year-old. But he says, all of us, whether we're blind or not, are terribly greedy. We want things only for ourselves. There it is again, the I. Even without realizing it, we want the universe to be like us and to give us all the room in it. But a blind child learns very quickly that this cannot be. He has to learn it. For every time he forgets that he is not alone in the world, he strikes against an object, hurts himself, and is called to order. But each time he remembers, he is rewarded, for everything comes his way. So this is like a kind of very meticulous education in making room for the infinitude of others, of the other, and allowing them that way, with not knowing, to come towards us. As a blind person, he was not putting, and could not put, knowing ahead of himself. He had to let things come to meet him. So it points to the way that the real intimacy that we open up in practice is a continuing kind of conversation of touch, of being touched and returning the touch, which begins to open up the mysterious matter of the Heart Sutra. This is the sutra that we chanted this morning. It's the first sort of large matter we take up in the sutra service, which is very carefully composed through. It's a composition right through that service. We move from the acknowledgement that we're completely human, we make mistakes and we hurt each other. We acknowledge that, and we own that fact completely before we take a step into the space of the sutra service. And then we encounter this great not knowing of the Heart Sutra. If you hear that word, that sutra chanted in Sino-Japanese, you'll hear mu, 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 mu going through it like a heartbeat. Because there's all those no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. No suffering, no cause of suffering, no anguish, path. It's a complete undoing, not just of the self, but of all that the self could ever construct as a kind of barrier to the fullness that is here. So it's very interesting to look at the Heart Sutra and see that compassion is revealed right at the very core of this not knowing. It is compassion that lays bare the not knowing in this case, because we have a conversation happening here between Shariputra and the embodiment of compassion, known in this case as Avalokiteshvara, also known as Kunanyi in Chinese, Kanon in Japanese. This is your own fullest extension of heart and mind, compassion. Now in this case it's embodied as a figure called Avalokiteshvara, who interestingly begins as male in India, and by the time he has travelled to China, has become a woman. Kunanyi is much more like a woman. And that's very interesting in itself. But sutras actually literally mean the threads of discourse of the Buddha, the threads of the awakened one, the discourse of words spoken. But the Buddha is quite silent in the Heart Sutra. The Buddha is listening. The very thing that Kirk's opening, his encouraging words encouraged us to do today. Listen. So the Buddha listens as Avalokiteshvara, compassion herself, sits in deep samadhi and speaks from that place about the nature of reality to Shariputra. And Shariputra is the disciple of the Buddha who is most associated with the Abhidharma, the whole traditional matter in Buddhism of that there is suffering, the Four Noble Truths, the path through and beyond suffering. So even all of that marvelous teaching, that useful, practical teaching, Avalokiteshvara says, there is no path, there is no suffering, there is no end to suffering, there is no old age and death, and also no ending of old age and death. Allows us to see that all the categories we put upon the world are blessedly empty. And even the category we call I, myself, is blessedly empty, which means full, complete, overflowing with everything that's here. So, so the Heart Sutra works its way through, in a sense, to the point where we can see that it is the deepest impulse we can find in ourselves that we call compassion, complete openness to the other, no barrier to the other. That intimacy is completely arising with or born with, not knowing, unknowing, mu. This strange gate of not, of none, of undoing. The undoing of the separate self. So, come back to the Song of Solomon. I sleep, but my heart wakes. You could say that's a lovely summary of the Heart Sutra. I sleep, but my heart wakes. Heart-mind wakes. Or, body and mind. Of this body and mind and the body and mind of others fall away. The earth wakes us, and we awaken to a completely awake earth. So there is this sense of when you wake up, everything wakes with you. Or you discover yourself in a completely awake reality. Much later down the track of our ancestors, we come to what's some person who's often referred to as a crazy wisdom character, Ikkyu, the poet Ikkyu, Japanese 14th and 15th century poet and Zen master. I'd like to read you a little bit about the moment where he had body and mind dropped away. I'm reading from Red Thread Zen at this point, because it has in it a beautiful way of seeing how everything falls away into its most original, timeless place. Just as Mount Wellington is luckily falling away into Kunanyi, and even less than that. So, Zen master and poet Ikkyu realized the true nature of his entire body, the true nature of his entire body, which is not limited to this body, while lying in a rowboat in the dark on Lake Biwa, when across those darkened waters came the sudden cry of a crow. Ah! And suddenly Ikkyu had nowhere to put his entire body. Right there in that small boat, vast lake, huge night sky, miraculous sound. Later on he wrote these words about it. He said, hearing a crow cry with no mouth. Hearing a crow with no mouth cry in the deep darkness of the night. I feel a longing for my father before he was born. My father before he was born. This immediately calls to mind an old koan about what is your original face before even your parents were born. That's what this crow wakes up in him. Crow cry can have so many quasi-human edges in it, can't it? Uncannily suggesting, and somehow all at once, homelessness, nameless sorrow or regret, an indeterminate edge of fear that might be exile, some kind of bitter strength. Mary Oliver called it the deep muscle of the world. This makes them powerful prophets. In the Australian Indigenous Dreamtime, crows can fly backward when they wish. Crows are carrion eaters, opportunists, that turn a cold eye on those same proclivities evident in us. Or so it can feel when they choose to let down 3 slow, soul-withering comments as they trawl the open sky, 3 deepening tones of dark contempt. Cack, cack, cack. But in that rowboat on the lake, it is a crow with no mouth, moo mouth, that kindly restores to full life an ear with no IQ, so wonderfully humanly empty, leaving no one here to know, which would be to replace what is, the whole of it, with petty mental moves of this and that. IQ's longing for my father before he was born that surges through with grievous joy, brushes the great koan original face, which in turn so delicately touches this fertile dark of our being, our shared, unborn mind, that lies open infinitely earlier than conception, our own conception. Hearing a crow with no mouth, there was no crow at that moment, and certainly no IQ. IQ's depth of seeing brings together human longing and the inconceivable. That's what restores our full immediacy of ready hands and eyes able to be of some help. Les Anderson's poem, it's called On the Nature of Things, brings a squawking crow completely at home in unknowing, together with the grievous joy of the moments when I will never know what I am. This is a little bit of the poem. He says, the squawking crow flies down from the redwood tree to tell me he is not a crow. No bird, not passerine bird of the family Corvidae, nor mind, nor body, nor thing, and not a crow. When you meet a crow, you know they're saying, I am not a crow. In fact, he says, he hasn't even been discovered yet. Mm-hmm. Then the poet goes on to speak of the longing to know that can take a child by the throat, and draw them towards a dream of completeness. And the poem talks about climbing a marble stairway to a magical room where he'll be able to open and read a book called The Book of What Each Thing Is. This is our deep desire as human beings to take hold of each mysterious matter, the book of what each thing is. And it reminded me of a dream I had as a child. In the dream I dreamt that I had fallen asleep exactly where I had fallen asleep, but that I woke there in the dream. And I woke because coming down through the electric wires was a whole little bunch of fairies, and they were bringing with them a book. They had a book to bring me. And they flew down and they placed it in my hands. And this all-surpassing jewel-encrusted book that I knew contained the secret of what everything is, like the secret of reality. In my dream, I accepted the book. I thought, yes, this is for me. I took the book and drew it open. And the page that fell open had marvellous, untellable images, gold embossed, gorgeously coloured. And then, the moment that the sunlight fell upon the page, the open page, as my eyes rushed to absorb it and imprint what was there, the page faded to white, faster than thought. And in the dream I turned another page and I could see exactly the same thing was happening, so I snapped the book shut. I can't let anything be lost from here, but I'll never be able to read it and have it in that form. It was better to do that than to jeopardize it with my greed, you know. And I think of Robert Aitken's warning. Robert Aitken, my old teacher, our old teacher in this lineage. He said, we are not here to clear the mystery up. We are here to make the mystery clear. And it is Mu that makes the mystery clear. I'm happy to call Mu the very doorway of that mystery. And our practice is the loving act of making or allowing that mystery to be clearer and clearer in our hearts, to actualize the movement of the heart, the actions of the heart, the open heart. So this unknowing and the movement of the heart that we call compassion, that is unbidden. It's not, you can't instruct compassion to be there. It is, in a sense, in the deeper sense, nothing to do with us ourselves. It is a kind of movement that belongs wider than us and flows through us. We're just the points through which it flows. So I want to end with, since I raised Robert Aitken into the room, I want to end with one of his Zen Master Raven cases. Zen Master Raven is curiously like Robert Aitken, actually. I think it might be the same person, except in this case he is a raven and he's losing the top pinwheels from his feathers. And he's become a Zen teacher, and every now and then, on a regular basis, the animals come and gather under the old pine tree. And you get to know some of these other characters. There's mole, and there's grouse, Reverend Crane, owl, and so on. But in this case it's mole, young female mole, who, by the way, goes on to become a Zen teacher. Things happen in this world. So, the case is called compassion. And it's very simple. Mole spoke up after a long silence one evening. You know, our practice is the practice of holding a long, rich, fertile silence for each other. And so the eye can sleep and the heart can wake. Mole spoke up after a long silence one evening and asked, "What's compassion?" Raven said, "That's an inside story." Mole asked, "Inside what?" Raven said, "Stars on your fur." Stars on your fur. So, compassion. The inside story that turns out to simply have no outside. And if this great matter of Mu has no outside to it, and I assure you it has no outside to it, there is nothing outside Mu, then you could no more keep the far-flung stars out of your fur, if you're a little mole, then you can keep the love and the compassion out of not knowing. Inside, outside, stars at a vast distance embedded in the fur of a little creature. Compassion, complete interconnectedness, no gap, no time or space. An inside story. That's what we're working on here. So thank you for your trouble.